After dinner, wife demands I pay $8,800 or lose my family. When you discover your life isn't what you thought it was, how far would you go to take back control? In my case, it all began with one dinner, one shocking revelation that sent everything spiraling. By the end of this story, you'll see how I uncovered the truth, turned the tables, and made a decision that would change everything. Don't look away, because this isn't just about betrayal. It's about what happens when you finally had enough. That night started out like any other, or at least I thought it would. My wife, Natalie, had planned a nice dinner at a fancy restaurant, the kind of place I wouldn't normally choose. But she insisted. "It's just one night," she'd said, brushing off my reluctance. I let it go, telling myself that it couldn't hurt to indulge her every once in a while. Still, walking into that dimly lit, over-the-top venue, I couldn't help but feel out of place. The chandeliers above us sparkled with a cold, distant light, and the air smelled faintly of truffle oil and imported leather. It wasn't exactly my scene. I've always been more of a simple guy, burgers and beers at the local bar, not $100 steaks served under glass domes. But Natalie loved these places. She thrived in them. I watched as she moved through the room with that effortless grace she always had. Her smile bright, her laugh ringing out like a bell. She looked incredible in her designer dress, hairstyle just right, makeup flawless. She belonged there, I didn't. Our table was set perfectly, of course. Crystal glasses, shining silverware, and folded napkins that probably cost more than my favorite pair of boots. Natalie's mother and sister joined us, both looking like they'd stepped out of a magazine. Barbara, her mother, wore an emerald green outfit that matched her carefully chosen earrings, while Vanessa, her sister, had on a sleek black dress that must have come straight from some high-end boutique. They greeted me with polite smiles, the kind that didn't quite reach their eyes. I knew that look. I'd seen it before. It said, "You're not one of us." They didn't have to say it out loud. Every gesture, every glance said it for them. Dinner started off pleasant enough. The waiter came by with a wine list that was more like a novel, and Natalie chose a bottle without even glancing at the price. The first course was some sort of delicate seafood dish I couldn't pronounce. I tried to keep the conversation going, asking about Vanessa's new job and Barbara's latest charity event. They answered politely, but quickly turned the conversation back to topics I had no way of contributing to: luxury vacations, designer labels, art galleries. I nodded along, offering a few comments here and there, but mostly I just felt like I was sitting on the outside, looking in. Natalie didn't seem to notice. She was glowing, laughing at Barbara's stories, sharing inside jokes with Vanessa, like the three of them were in their own world. I sipped my wine and tried not to let it bother me. This was her family. Of course they had their own dynamic, but something about the way they treated me like a visitor, not a partner, gnawed at me more than I wanted to admit. By the time the main course arrived, my patience was wearing thin. The steak on my plate was a work of art, cooked to perfection, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. Barbara had just finished making a pointed comment about the economy, and how some jobs just aren't what they used to be. She didn't mention my job directly, but I knew exactly what she meant. Vanessa smirked, twirling her wine glass, her gaze drifting over me like I wasn't even there. And Natalie, she just smiled. She didn't defend me. She didn't change the subject. She let it happen, her expression unreadable. I gripped my fork tightly, forcing a smile, but inside I was burning. I'd spent years working long hours, saving carefully, doing my best to build a stable life. I wasn't ashamed of my job, my modest apartment, or my quiet routines. I'd thought Natalie respected that about me. Now, I wasn't so sure. The final straw came when the check arrived. I thought we'd agreed to split it beforehand. I'd even confirmed it with Natalie earlier in the week. But as the waiter placed the leather folder on the table, she slid it toward me with a playful smile. "Go ahead, James," she said, her voice light, almost teasing. I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh and say she was kidding. She didn't. Barbara watched with a pleased expression. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, and I realized this was no joke. "I thought we were splitting this," I said, my voice low, trying to keep the anger out of it. Natalie's smile didn't waver. "Not anymore," she replied simply, twirling the stem of her wine glass. "It's your turn." In that moment, it hit me: this wasn't just a dinner. It was a test, a game. a way to see how far they could push me. I felt a cold wave of anger, confusion, and something deeper, betrayal. The woman I'd married, the woman I thought I knew, was siding with them. She was part of it. I could see it in her eyes, in the slight curve of her lips, in the way she casually dismissed my words. My heart pounded as I looked down at the bill. The number stared back at me, absurdly high, a symbol of everything that was wrong with this picture. I thought about standing up, walking out, leaving them to figure it out on their own. But then I thought about what would happen next. If I walked away, I'd be painted as the bad guy, the man who couldn't handle a simple dinner bill, who left his wife in the lurch. They'd win. They'd get exactly what they wanted. So I pulled out my wallet, my hand trembling slightly, and I paid. I signed my name with a heavy heart, the pen feeling like a lead weight in my hand. When I handed the folder back to the waiter, I stood, looking at Natalie for some sign. Some recognition that she understood what this meant. What it had cost me, not just the money, but something far more valuable. But she didn't look at me. She was already chatting with Vanessa, like nothing had happened. Like it was just another night out. I walked out of that restaurant feeling like I'd left more than a few dollars behind. I'd left a piece of myself there too. A piece I wasn't sure I'd ever get back. I didn't sleep well that night. The entire dinner played over and over in my mind, each word sharper, each glance colder. Natalie's casual dismissal, the smug smirks on her mother's and sister's faces. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just one bad evening, but a reflection of something much deeper. I kept asking myself if I had been blind to it all, or if they had only recently decided to treat me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. I woke up feeling drained, the kind of exhaustion that goes beyond lack of sleep. My chest felt tight, and my stomach churned as if I were bracing for another confrontation before the day had even begun. I tried to push it all aside as I got ready for work. Another day at the tech company. Another round of deadlines, projects, and meetings. Normally, that routine gave me some sense of stability, but today, I just felt like I was going through the motions. I couldn't focus. Even as I stared at lines of code on my screen, my mind kept drifting back to that dinner, how I had sat there, silently enduring their thinly veiled jabs, feeling like a complete outsider. By the time I got home, I was exhausted. I thought maybe I'd walk in, grab a beer from the fridge, and just sit on the couch until my brain stopped buzzing. But as soon as I opened the door, I knew that wasn't going to happen. Natalie was sitting on the couch, her arms crossed, her face set in that expression she always used when she wanted something from me but didn't want to come right out and say it. I knew the look well. "James, we need to talk," she said, her tone more clipped than usual. I shut the door and stood there for a moment, trying to gauge the situation. "Sure," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "What's on your mind?" She stood up, smoothing her skirt in that practiced way of hers, and walked over to the kitchen counter. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice softer now, but still with that edge that made my shoulders tense. "Last night. Well, maybe it didn't go the way I hoped. But I think we need to make some changes." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "Changes?" I echoed. "What kind of changes?" She glanced at me, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "Look, James, I know you're working hard. I know you've been doing your best. But, well, sometimes I feel like I'm the only one who's really thinking about the bigger picture." That comment hit me like a punch in the gut, but I didn't respond right away. I just watched her as she moved around the kitchen, opening a cupboard, pulling out a glass, pouring herself some water. She was always so controlled, so polished, even in moments like this. It was almost infuriating. "Maybe I'm not following you," I said, keeping my tone even. "What exactly is the bigger picture you're talking about?" She took a sip of water, then set the glass down carefully. "The future," she said simply. "Our future. I mean, I'm trying to build something here, James. Something real, something lasting. And I just feel like, I don't know, like maybe you're not on the same page." My jaw tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Not on the same page?" I repeated. "Natalie, I've been working my ass off to give us a stable life. I don't understand what more you want from me." She sighed, a long, drawn-out exhale that seemed rehearsed. "It's not just about working hard," she said. "It's about having ambition. About seeing opportunities and taking them. I mean, look at Barbara and Vanessa. They've figured it out. They've built these amazing lives for themselves. And honestly, sometimes it feels like we're just stuck. That word stuck hung in the air like a bad smell. I could feel the anger rising, but I held it back, knowing that snapping now would only give her more ammunition. So, what are you saying? I asked. That I'm not good enough? That I'm holding you back? She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she shook her head. No, James, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying, I need to see some kind of change. Some kind of forward momentum. That was when I realized this wasn't just a conversation. It was an ultimatum. She wasn't asking for more communication or more time together. She was asking for me to become someone I wasn't. Someone who could match her mother's relentless ambition, her sister's polished lifestyle. Someone who fit into the image she had in her head of what a husband should be. And if I didn't? Well, I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. I leaned back against the doorframe, running a hand through my hair. So, what does that mean for us? I asked. Are you saying you're not happy? That you don't want to be here anymore? She hesitated, and for the first time, I saw something break through her composed exterior. Uncertainty. Doubt. I don't know, James, she said finally. I need to think. I need to figure out what I really want. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, like something had shifted and wouldn't go back to where it belonged. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the moments I'd believed we were building something solid, something real. And now, in a matter of minutes, it felt like it was slipping away. I see, I said quietly. Well, take all the time you need. She gave me a small, tight smile, more of a polite gesture than anything else, and went upstairs. I stood there in the silence, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards as she walked down the hallway. The soft click of the bedroom door closing behind her. I didn't move for a long time. I just stared at the spot where she'd been standing, feeling like I was caught in some kind of surreal dream. The room seemed colder, emptier. I finally went to the fridge and grabbed that beer I'd been thinking about earlier. I sat down on the couch, popped the top, and took a long drink. The bitterness of the beer matched the bitterness in my chest. I knew this wasn't the end of the conversation. It was just the beginning. And I had no idea what was coming next. Wait, did you catch that? Just when I thought I knew what was happening, something changed. And now, I'm faced with a choice that could either set things right or make everything worse. What would you do if you were me? Would you confront them and risk it all? Or would you keep your distance and try to move on? Comment 1 if you think I should fight back. Or comment 2 if you think I should walk away. I want to hear your thoughts. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Natalie was next to me. Her breathing steady, as if the events of the day hadn't rattled her at all. I kept running through our conversation earlier, trying to make sense of it. She said she needed to think about what she wanted. But that was just another way of saying she wasn't happy with the life we built. And what could I do about that? I was working as hard as I could, giving everything I had to make our life stable and secure. But apparently, that wasn't enough. That word stuck kept echoing in my head. Was I stuck? I didn't think so. I thought we had something solid, something we could count on. But now I wasn't sure. I kept thinking about the dinner. How everyone else at that table seemed so at ease with the world they lived in. The expensive clothes, the fine wine, the effortless smiles. And then there was me, struggling to keep up, trying not to let their judgments sink in. Maybe they'd been right all along. Maybe I didn't belong. The next morning, I got up before Natalie. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I made a pot of coffee and stood in the kitchen, staring out the window at the street below. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and everything was bathed in a pale, gray light. I tried to focus on what needed to be done that day: work tasks, errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, my thoughts kept circling back to that uneasy feeling. I felt like a stranger in my own home. Natalie and I used to talk about everything. We used to laugh at each other's jokes, sit together on the couch, and share stories about our day. When had that stopped? When had we become two people living under the same roof, speaking different languages? By the time I left for work, I was already drained. The commute felt longer than usual, the gray skies matching my mood. At my desk, I stared at the screen, trying to lose myself in the lines of code, but I couldn't concentrate. My colleagues chatted around me, their voices a low murmur. They all seemed so focused, so absorbed in their work. I felt like I was floating outside of it all, disconnected. Even when my manager stopped by to discuss a new project, I could barely muster the energy to respond. I nodded, said all the right things, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. I kept thinking about Natalie's words, her disappointment, her need for change. I'd never thought of myself as someone who lacked ambition. I'd worked hard for everything I had. But in her eyes, it wasn't enough. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't know how to be the person she wanted me to be. At lunch, I skipped the usual cafeteria crowd and walked to a nearby park. The air was brisk, the wind tugging at my coat as I sat on a bench and stared at the bare branches overhead. I thought about calling a friend, someone who could offer advice, but I didn't know what to say. "Hey, my wife thinks I'm not ambitious enough. What do you think I should do?" It sounded ridiculous even in my head. I leaned back against the bench, rubbing my hands together for warmth. A couple walked by, laughing and holding hands, and I felt a pang of envy. I wanted that easy connection, that sense of being on the same team. But it seemed like Natalie and I were playing different games now, following different rules. I thought about our first year of marriage, how everything had felt so full of possibility. We didn't have much money, but we didn't care. We had each other. We were happy with small joys, cooking dinner together, taking walks in the neighborhood, dreaming about the future. Now, those days felt like a lifetime ago. Somewhere along the way, we'd lost our rhythm, our shared vision. I didn't know how to get it back, or if it was even possible. When I got home that evening, Natalie wasn't there. She'd left a note on the counter, something about meeting a friend for drinks. I stared at the note for a long time, my mind churning. I wanted to be angry, but I wasn't. I was just tired. Tired of the tension, tired of trying to figure out what she wanted from me. I sat down on the couch, the room eerily quiet. I thought about turning on the TV, but the idea of the sound felt jarring. Instead, I sat there in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was fighting a battle. I couldn't win. No matter what I did, it wouldn't be enough. Natalie was looking for something I didn't know how to give. I was trying to hold on, but the harder I tried, the further she seemed to slip away. As the night wore on, I found myself thinking about our wedding day. The look in her eyes. When we said our vows, the way she smiled at me as we danced at the reception. I had believed in us then. I had believed we could face anything together. But now, I didn't know what I believed anymore. I still loved her, but love didn't feel like enough. Not when she was questioning everything we had. I wanted to tell her how I felt, to ask her why things had changed, but I was afraid of the answer. What if she didn't love me the same way anymore? What if she was already halfway out the door? I sat there, my hands resting on my knees, my eyes fixed on the floor. I needed to figure out what I wanted, too. I needed to decide if I could keep living like this, always wondering if I was good enough, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. The silence in the house was deafening, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely and utterly alone. It was late, the kind of late where the house was so quiet, it almost felt abandoned. I'd been sitting on the couch for what felt like hours, staring at the wall, trying to piece together how everything had spiraled so far out of control. Natalie wasn't back yet, and I had no idea where she was. The note on the counter hadn't mentioned when she'd be home, and I hadn't bothered to text her. Honestly, I didn't even know what I'd say if I did. My phone sat silent on the coffee table in front of me, the screen dark, untouched. Part of me wanted it to stay that way, but another part of me kept glancing at it, waiting for something, an explanation, an apology, anything to tell me what was going on inside her head. But the phone didn't buzz. It just sat there, as cold and quiet as the room around me. I got up, pacing the length of the living room, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The moonlight spilled through the blinds, painting faint lines across the walls. Everything about the house felt unfamiliar tonight. It was the same space we'd shared for years, pictures on the shelves, the old quilt draped over the back of the couch, the slightly crooked lamp by the corner table, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt hollow, like a shell of the life we used to have. I could still remember when we first moved in, unpacking boxes, laughing at how little furniture we had. dreaming about the future we'd build here together. That seemed like a different lifetime now. I stopped at the window and peered out, seeing nothing but the empty street below. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the faint hum of a distant car was the only sound. I felt an ache in my chest I couldn't quite place, a mix of anger, sadness, and something else I didn't want to admit, fear. I walked back to the couch and sat down heavily, leaning forward, my elbows on my knees. My hands hung loosely between my legs as I stared down at the carpet. A memory came unbidden, catching me off guard. It was from years ago, before we were married. Natalie and I had gone hiking on a whim one weekend, driving out to some state park she'd read about online. We'd gotten lost on the trail, wandering for hours, and we ended up sitting on a rock by a small stream, sharing a granola bar and laughing at how bad we were at reading maps. That was one of the best days of my life, simple, carefree, just the two of us. Now, sitting alone in that silent living room, I felt like I'd lost something I couldn't get back. Like that version of us was gone forever. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Almost midnight. I stood up again, the restlessness inside me growing. I moved to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and stared inside. The light spilled out, making the room feel a little less dark. I wasn't hungry, but I grabbed a beer anyway, cracking it open and taking a long drink. The bitterness rolled over my tongue, grounding me, at least for a moment. I closed the fridge and leaned against the counter, letting out a slow breath. What was she doing? Who was she with? The questions kept coming, and I had no answers. That word from before, stuck, flashed in my mind again. If I was stuck, then what was she? Lost? I didn't know, and it was killing me. The silence of the house pressed in around me, so heavy it felt like I couldn't breathe. As I took another sip, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I froze, the sound cutting through the quiet like a knife. For a second, I just stood there, staring at it from across the room. Finally, I set the beer on the counter and walked over, picking it up. It wasn't Natalie. It was a text from my brother, Dan. He lived halfway across the country, but we talked now and then, usually about sports or family stuff. His message was short: "Hey, just checking in. Everything okay?" I stared at the words, my thumb hovering over the screen. I considered calling him, pouring it all out, how things were falling apart, how I didn't know what to do. But I didn't. Instead, I typed back a quick response. "Yeah, just tired. Thanks for checking." I hit send and put the phone down, the weight in my chest still there. Dan meant well, but what could he do? This was my mess. I had to figure it out on my own. I sank back down on the couch, the beer still sitting on the kitchen counter untouched. The room felt even quieter now, if that was possible. I thought about Natalie again, the way she looked at me that morning, like I was a stranger. I thought about the dinner, how her mother's words still stung. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the good times, the laughter, the plans we made. I wanted to believe we could fix it. I wanted to believe we could get back to where we were. But the truth was, I didn't know if that was possible. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something, staring into a void, and I didn't know what was on the other side. The room grew darker as the moonlight shifted, and I just sat there, my thoughts spinning, unable to stop them. It was just after dawn when the phone finally rang. I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing my third cup of coffee, the bitterness barely touching the haze that hung over my mind. Natalie had come home late, later than usual. She didn't say much. Just walked in, placed her bag on the counter, and disappeared into the bedroom without a word. I'd stayed up, half expecting her to explain where she'd been, but all I got was silence. By the time I finally drifted off on the couch, it was almost morning. Now the sound of the phone rattling against the hard surface jarred me awake. I grabbed it, glanced at the caller ID. It was her mother. My gut tightened. "James," Barbara's voice came through, cool and sharp as always. "I hope I'm not waking you." I rubbed my temple and leaned back in the chair. "No, I'm up," I said, trying to sound more alert than I felt. There was a brief pause, just long enough for me to feel the tension creeping in. "I just wanted to touch base," she said. Her words carefully chosen, as if she were delivering a prepared statement. "I know Natalie's been under a lot of stress lately." That last part hung in the air, her tone dripping with meaning. I could hear the unspoken accusation in her voice. She didn't have to say it outright, she thought I was the problem. Yeah, she's mentioned it, I said, keeping my voice steady. I wasn't about to get into an argument with Barbara over the phone. Not now, not after the night I'd just had. Is there something I can help you with? I asked, knowing full well she wasn't calling to ask for help. Barbara sighed, a long, dramatic exhale that I could almost see through the phone. I'm just concerned, she said. Natalie's always been so driven, so focused. And now, well, she just seems distracted, uncertain. She let that last word linger, as if she were waiting for me to fill in the blanks. I appreciate your concern, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. But I think she's just going through a rough patch. We all do, sometimes. Barbara made a noise that could have been agreement or disapproval. Of course, she said, her tone unreadable. Just know that we're here if she needs anything. She didn't say if you need anything, and I noticed that. The call ended quickly after that, and I put the phone down on the table, my fingers lingering on it for a moment before I pushed it away. I stared at my coffee cup, the ceramic rim chipped from years of use. It was one of those things I never thought much about before, but now I couldn't stop looking at it. The chip was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, a tiny imperfection that suddenly felt enormous. I picked it up and turned it in my hands, the rough edge scraping lightly against my thumb. I wondered how many little cracks had formed in our life together, tiny, almost invisible flaws that I'd ignored, thinking they didn't matter. Now they felt impossible to ignore. I put the cup down and leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes for a moment. I could still hear Barbara's voice in my head, that polite, concerned tone that carried so much judgment. It wasn't just Barbara, though. It was everything. The weight of all the unspoken things that had built up between Natalie and me. All the moments I thought we were okay when we clearly weren't. They were catching up with me now, and I couldn't shake them off. When Natalie finally emerged from the bedroom, she looked like she hadn't slept much either. Her hair was still mussed, her makeup faintly smudged under her eyes. She grabbed a glass of water from the sink and leaned against the counter, not meeting my gaze. "Morning," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound casual, like I hadn't spent the last half hour dissecting every word her mother said. She drank her water in silence, the glass cool and smooth in her hand. I wanted to say something, to ask where she'd been, what she was thinking, why she hadn't talked to me last night. But I didn't. I didn't know how to start, or if it would make any difference. The silence between us was louder than any words could be. Natalie set the glass down and turned toward me, her arms crossed. "I have to meet Vanessa this afternoon," she said, finally looking me in the eye. "She's got some ideas for something I've been thinking about." I nodded slowly, not sure what she meant. "Sounds good," I said, even though it didn't. I felt like I was talking to a stranger, someone I didn't quite know anymore. "Do you want me to come with you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She shook her head. "No, it's fine. It's just a quick meeting." She paused, then added, "It's probably best if I go alone." I nodded again, the tightness in my chest growing. "All right," I said. "Just let me know if you need anything." She nodded and left the room, her footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. I stared at the empty doorway, my hands gripping the edge of the table. The house felt colder after she left. I sat there for a while, not sure what to do next. My mind wandered back to that chip in the coffee cup, that small, stubborn flaw that wouldn't go away. I thought about calling Dan again, just to hear a familiar voice, but I didn't. Instead, I reached for my coffee, the rough edge pressing against my fingers as I took a sip. I told myself that it was just another day, just another bump in the road. But deep down, I knew better. The cracks were getting bigger, and I wasn't sure if we could fix them. Later that afternoon, I found myself sitting on the couch again, the TV flickering in the background. But I wasn't really paying attention. My mind was still stuck in the same endless loop, replaying every conversation, every glance, every word Natalie had said or not said over the past few days. I tried to shake it off, to focus on something else, but it wasn't working. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like the walls of this house were closing in on me. Each room carried a memory of a time when things were different, when we were different. It was suffocating. I grabbed my jacket, deciding that I needed to get out of there. even if it was just for a short walk. The crisp autumn air hit me the moment I stepped outside, a sharp contrast to the stifling stillness of the house. I started down the sidewalk, hands shoved in my pockets, my breath forming small clouds in the cool air. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every little sound, leaves crunching underfoot, the faint bark of a distant dog, feel amplified. I followed the same route I always took, past the row of maple trees lining the street, their fiery red and orange leaves falling in slow spirals to the ground. It was a picture-perfect scene, the kind of setting that should have been calming, maybe even comforting. But I didn't feel calm. I felt like I was walking in a dream, each step disconnected from the next. I passed the corner cafe where Natalie and I used to stop on Sunday mornings. I could still picture her sitting at the little round table by the window, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, her eyes sparkling as she talked about her latest project, or a new recipe she wanted to try. It had been our ritual, something simple and steady. Now it felt like a lifetime ago. I kept walking, not sure where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stop. If I stopped, the thoughts would catch up to me, and I wasn't ready to face them yet. I wandered into the park at the edge of the neighborhood, the gravel path crunching under my boots. The playground was empty, the swing swaying slightly in the breeze. I found a bench near the duck pond and sat down, watching the water ripple under the soft light of the setting sun. The ducks moved lazily across the surface, oblivious to everything, and for a moment, I envied them. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through emails and messages, but nothing held my attention. I opened the news app, skimmed a few headlines, then closed it again. My phone was full of distractions, but none of them were enough. I needed answers, clarity, something to make sense of all the chaos in my head. As I sat there, I realized I hadn't really spoken to anyone about this, not my friends, not my brother, not even Natalie herself. I'd been holding it all in, trying to figure it out on my own, but it wasn't working. I thought about texting Dan again, maybe calling him, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What was I going to say? That I was falling apart? That my marriage was crumbling and I didn't know how to stop it? I leaned back on the bench, tilting my head toward the sky. The first few stars were starting to peek through the twilight, faint pinpricks of light against the deepening blue. It was beautiful, in a way, but it didn't help. It just made me feel smaller, more lost. I stayed in the park until the air turned colder, until I could see my breath in front of me. The streetlights flickered on as I made my way back home, their warm glow casting long shadows on the sidewalk. By the time I reached the house, it was fully dark. I stood at the front door for a moment, staring at the worn paint on the frame. This house, this life, it used to feel like a safe place. Now it felt like a maze I couldn't find my way out of. I opened the door and stepped inside, the familiar creak of the hinges greeting me like an old, tired friend. Natalie was in the kitchen, her back to me as she chopped vegetables on the cutting board. The sound of the knife against the wood was steady, almost rhythmic. She didn't turn around when I walked in. "Hey," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Hey," she replied, still focused on her task. I watched her for a moment, taking in the curve of her shoulders, the way her hair fell over her face. She looked tired, but then again, so did I. "What are you making?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything else. "Just a salad," she said, her tone neutral. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I wanted to say more, to ask her what was on her mind, to tell her what was on mine. But the words wouldn't come. They sat heavy in my chest, pressing down like a weight I couldn't lift. I grabbed a glass from the cabinet, filled it with water, and leaned against the counter. She finished chopping, scooping the vegetables into a bowl. "You're quiet tonight," she said, finally looking up at me. I met her eyes, searching for something, an opening, a way to start the conversation I knew we needed to have. "Yeah," I said, my voice soft. "Just a lot on my mind." She nodded slowly, as if she understood. But the silence that followed felt like a wall between us. We ate dinner together at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared so many meals before. But this time, the air was heavy, the sound of forks scraping plates louder than any words. I tried to find something to say, anything that might bridge the gap between us. But nothing felt right. Nothing felt enough. After dinner, she went back to her work, and I found myself on the couch again, staring at the TV, without seeing it. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. And I was alone again, with nothing but my thoughts and the weight of everything we'd left unsaid. I couldn't sleep that night. I'd been tossing and turning for hours, my mind racing with everything I'd been too afraid to say. Natalie had gone to bed early, but I stayed in the living room, staring out the window into the quiet street. The glow of the streetlights reflected off the cars parked along the curb, their silhouettes blurred by the light fog that had rolled in. The scene outside was peaceful, so different from the chaos I felt inside. Every minute felt heavier than the last, and I kept going over our last few conversations, trying to understand what I'd missed. Where had I gone wrong? I ran my hand through my hair, frustrated with myself for not seeing it sooner. I knew something was off, but I never imagined it would come to this. I got up and paced the room, my footsteps muffled by the rug. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, each second dragging on like an hour. My chest felt tight, my thoughts circling the same questions over and over again. Did she still care about me? About us? Or was I just fooling myself, clinging to something that had already slipped away? I knew I had to talk to her, to lay it all out in the open. But the thought of that conversation made my stomach turn. What if she confirmed what I feared? What if she said she didn't love me anymore? I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming back. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the dim overhead light, and opened the fridge. The cold air hit my face as I stared at the rows of jars and containers, not really seeing them. I grabbed a beer, popped the top off, and took a long sip. The bitterness was grounding, a small distraction from the storm in my head. I leaned against the counter, staring at the floor. It was funny, in a way. I'd always prided myself on being a guy who could handle anything. I'd been through tough times before, and I'd always found a way to push through. But this was different. This was my marriage, my life, and I didn't know if I could fix it. Natalie's words from earlier still echoed in my mind. I just don't know if this is what I want anymore. That's what she'd said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. But the words hit me like a punch to the gut. How do you respond to something like that? What can you say to change someone's heart when they're already halfway out the door? I thought about all the times we'd laughed together. All the small, everyday moments that made our life feel complete. I thought about the nights we'd stayed up late talking about nothing in particular, just enjoying each other's company. Were those moments gone for good? Or were they still there, buried under all the frustration and doubt? I drained the beer and set the bottle on the counter, the sound of glass on granite echoing in the empty room. The kitchen felt too quiet now, the faint hum of the refrigerator only making the silence more noticeable. I glanced at the clock above the stove too. 4:43 a.m. I should have been in bed hours ago, but I couldn't bring myself to go. I knew if I lay down next to her, I'd just end up staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I needed to clear my head, to get some perspective. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, the cool night air greeting me as I stepped outside. The neighborhood was still, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. I started walking, hands in my pockets, the familiar route giving me a sense of calm I hadn't felt all day. The trees along the sidewalk were bare, their branches reaching out like skeleton arms against the dark sky. The faint smell of damp leaves lingered in the air, and the occasional rustle of the wind was the only sound. I walked past the cafe where we used to go on weekends, the dark windows reflecting my silhouette as I passed. It felt strange, seeing these places that used to mean so much to us. They were just buildings, just streets, but they held so many memories. Memories I wasn't sure I could hold on to anymore. I turned down a side street, the glow of the main road fading behind me. The quiet here was almost eerie, but I welcomed it. It gave me room to think, to breathe. I thought about what I wanted to say to Natalie. I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the conversation. I needed to be honest, to tell her how I felt. I needed to know if we still had a chance, if she still saw a future for us. But what if the answer was no? What if I poured my heart out, and she said it was over? The thought made my chest tighten, my breath coming quicker. I stopped walking, leaning against a lamppost and taking a deep breath. I had to face it. Whatever the answer was, I had to know. After a while, I turned back toward home, the faint glow of the streetlights guiding me. The walk had helped, but only a little. My thoughts were still tangled, my emotions still raw. But at least I felt a bit more ready. I couldn't keep running from this. It was time to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I reached the house and opened the door quietly, the familiar creak of the hinges welcoming me back. The living room was dark, the faint light from the kitchen spilling into the hallway. I shrugged off my jacket and hung it on the hook by the door. I hesitated for a moment, staring down the hall toward our bedroom. I knew she'd be asleep, but I couldn't help but wonder if she was thinking about me. About us, before she closed her eyes. I walked down the hall, each step feeling heavier than the last. I opened the bedroom door gently, careful not to wake her. She was lying on her side, her face turned away, the covers pulled up to her shoulders. I stood there for a moment, watching her breathe. I wanted to reach out, to touch her shoulder, to whisper that I still loved her. But I didn't. I wasn't ready yet. Instead, I walked around to my side of the bed and slipped under the covers, the mattress shifting slightly as I settled in. I stared at the ceiling, the faint sound of her breathing the only noise in the room. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew I had to face it. I had to find out if we still had something worth fighting for, or if it was time to let go. When the sun came up, I was still lying there, staring at the ceiling. Natalie had gotten up before me, her side of the bed empty, and the blankets pulled tight. I could hear her moving around in the kitchen, the faint clink of a coffee cup against the counter. I should have felt more rested after a night in my own bed. But if anything, I felt worse. My body was heavy, my mind clouded with all the things I hadn't said the night before. I thought about staying there, shutting my eyes, pretending I didn't hear her. But that wasn't going to help. I had to get up. I had to face whatever was coming. I dragged myself out of bed and made my way down the hall. The smell of coffee hit me first, followed by the faint scent of cinnamon. Natalie had always liked to add a pinch of it to her morning brew, something she picked up from her grandmother. I thought about all the mornings we'd spent together, sitting at this very table, sharing our plans for the day. Back then, it felt easy. Now, it felt like walking into a stranger's kitchen. I found her standing by the window, staring out at the yard. She was holding her mug with both hands, her shoulders slightly hunched. The sunlight streamed in behind her, lighting up the streaks of auburn in her hair. She didn't turn around when I entered the room. "Morning," I said, my voice still groggy. "Morning," she replied without looking at me. Her voice was flat, almost distracted. I poured myself a cup of coffee and took a seat at the table. I didn't know how to start. My mind kept spinning through all the questions I wanted to ask her, but every one of them felt like a potential landmine. The silence between us stretched out, growing heavier by the second. Finally, I decided to say something, anything to break it. "Did you sleep okay?" I asked, cringing at how lame it sounded. "Not really," she said, still staring out the window. I nodded, even though she wasn't looking. "Yeah, me neither." I took a sip of coffee, the bitter warmth waking me up just a little. I wanted to ask her what she'd been thinking about last night, why she'd left the bed so early, what she'd meant by some of the things she'd said before we went to sleep. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't want to push her, to make her pull away even more. I didn't know how to reach her anymore. She turned away from the window and walked to the sink, rinsing out her mug. She kept her back to me, her movements deliberate, controlled. "I have to run some errands today," she said, her tone still distant. "I'll be out for a while." "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual. "What do you need to do?" She hesitated, just for a second, before answering. "Just some personal stuff. Nothing you need to worry about." She dried her hands on a dish towel and turned to face me. For a moment, our eyes met, and I thought I saw something there, maybe a flicker of the woman I used to know. The woman who used to laugh with me over the smallest things. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She gave me a small, forced smile and walked out of the room. I sat there for a long time after she left, staring at the empty mug in my hands. The house felt quieter than ever. The ticking of the clock on the wall the only sound. I didn't know where she was going, and I didn't ask. I just hoped she'd come back. But deep down, I knew that even if she did, it wouldn't change anything. Not unless we finally talked about what was really going on. Not unless I found the courage to ask her the questions that had been eating away at me. I spent the rest of the morning wandering around the house, not really doing anything. I picked up a book from the shelf in the living room, flipped through a few pages, then put it back. I turned on the TV, let it play in the background, but I wasn't really watching. I tried to focus on work, checking a few emails on my laptop, but my mind kept drifting. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was waiting for something, that everything was on hold until Natalie came back. It was like my life had been put on pause, and I didn't know how to press play again. By early afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and decided to go for a drive. I didn't have a destination in mind, just needed to get out, to feel the road beneath me, to clear my head. I rolled down the window, letting the cool breeze wash over me as I headed out of the neighborhood. The familiar streets blurred together as I drove, each one looking the same as the last. I thought about calling Dan, maybe meeting him for a drink, but I wasn't sure I was up for company. I wasn't sure I was ready to explain what was going on, even to him. I kept driving until I found myself on a quiet country road, the kind that winds through open fields and tall trees. The sky was a deep blue, the kind that only comes on a clear autumn day. It should have been peaceful, but my chest still felt tight, my mind still crowded with everything I couldn't say. I pulled over to the side of the road and shut off the engine, leaning back in the seat. The silence out here was different from the silence at home. It wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was just quiet. I sat there for a long time, watching the trees sway in the breeze, the sun casting long shadows across the fields. For the first time in days, I felt a small sense of calm, like I could finally breathe again. I thought about what I'd say to Natalie when I got home, how I'd try to reach her. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing: I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I had to try. Even if it didn't work, even if it hurt, I had to at least try. And with that thought, I started the engine and headed back home, ready to face whatever came next. When I walked back into the house, the silence felt different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet I'd left that morning. It was lighter, though I wasn't sure why. Natalie's car was still gone, and her coat wasn't hanging on the rack by the door. I set my keys down on the counter and stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where her coat usually hung. For some reason, that empty space hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't heard from her all day. No calls, no text, nothing. I didn't know where she'd gone or when she'd be back. A small part of me wondered if she'd come back at all. I leaned against the counter, letting out a long breath, the tension in my shoulders refusing to ease. The afternoon light filtered through the kitchen window, highlighting the dust motes that floated in the air. The house was eerily still, and I realized I didn't know what to do with myself. I walked into the living room, looking around as if I'd find some kind of clue, some answer. My eyes landed on a photo on the mantel, one of the few we'd taken together in the last year. It was from a weekend trip to the coast, a rare getaway that we both knew was more about patching things up than enjoying each other's company. In the photo, we were smiling, standing on a rocky outcrop with the waves crashing behind us. I picked up the frame and stared at it, the memory of that trip rushing back. I remembered the cold wind on my face, the smell of salt in the air, the way we'd forced ourselves to act like we were having a great time. Looking at it now, I wondered if she'd been just as unsure of us back then as she was now. Maybe more. I set the photo back down and walked to the window, looking out at the street. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. I thought about going back out, taking another drive, but something stopped me. I felt like I needed to stay here, to wait for her. I didn't know what I'd say when she came home, but I knew I had to say something. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that this was just a rough patch. It wasn't. We both knew it. I sat down on the couch, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees, staring at the coffee table. The small stack of magazines we never read sat neatly arranged in the corner. A half-burned candle stood in the middle, its wick charred and useless. I ran a hand through my hair, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The silence was oppressive again, and I reached for the remote, turning on the TV just for some background noise. I flipped through a few channels, not really watching, until I landed on a travel show featuring some tropical beach. The host was cheerful, pointing out all the best spots to visit, the perfect places to relax and unwind. I turned the volume down and stared at the screen, the vibrant blue water and white sand almost mocking in their simplicity. I couldn't even remember the last time Natalie and I had taken a real vacation, one that wasn't an attempt to fix something that had already broken. I tried to distract myself, but my thoughts kept circling back to the same questions. How did we get here? When did we start drifting apart? I thought about all the little moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, nights when we both went to bed without saying goodnight, mornings when we barely spoke over coffee, days when we were more like roommates than partners. Those moments added up, and now they felt like a mountain I couldn't climb. I thought about what I wanted to say to her, how I'd try to explain everything I was feeling. But the words felt clumsy and inadequate. I didn't know if I could make her understand. The sound of the garage door opening startled me, and I quickly turned off the TV. I stood up, my heart racing as I waited for her to come inside. The door to the garage opened, and she stepped into the kitchen, carrying a few grocery bags. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped and her movements slow. I watched her set the bags on the counter, her hair falling into her face as she started unpacking. "Hey," I said, my voice soft. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "Hey," she replied quietly, turning back to the groceries. I walked into the kitchen, leaning against the counter. "Need any help?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, I've got it." I nodded, standing there awkwardly, unsure of what to say next. I finally took a deep breath and said, "Natalie, we need to talk." She paused for a moment, then continued unpacking. "About what?" she asked, her tone neutral. "About us," I said, the words feeling heavy as they left my mouth. She didn't respond right away, but I could see her hands tighten slightly on the bag she was holding. After a moment, she set it down and turned to face me. "What do you want to say?" she asked, her voice calm but distant. I felt my throat tighten, but I forced myself to keep going. "I want to know where we stand. I want to know what you're feeling, what you're thinking. I need to know if you still want to do this, if you still want to be here with me." I hated how vulnerable I sounded, but I didn't care. I had to say it. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes softened just a little. She crossed her arms, leaning back against the counter. "James," she began, her voice quieter now. "I don't know. I've been trying to figure it out, but I don't know." Her words hung in the air, and I felt my chest tighten. "What do you mean you don't know?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked down at the floor, her brow furrowed. "I mean, I'm not sure what I want. I'm not sure if we can fix this, if we can get back to the way things used to be. I feel like we've been drifting for so long, and I don't know how to stop it." I swallowed hard, her words hitting me like a punch to the gut. I'd been expecting something like this, but hearing it out loud was different. It was real now. "We can't just give up," I said, my voice firmer than before. "We've been through too much to just let it all go. I know things haven't been great, but that doesn't mean we can't try to fix it. We owe it to ourselves to try." She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine. "What if trying isn't enough?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we just keep hurting each other?" I shook my head, stepping closer. "I don't believe that. I know we've made mistakes, and I know it's not going to be easy. But I still care about you, Natalie. I still want this to work. Don't you?" She didn't answer right away. She looked down at the floor, then back up at me, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know," she said again, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can do this anymore." My heart sank, but I refused to give up. "Please," I said, my voice trembling. "Just give me a chance. Let's figure this out together. I'm not ready to lose you. Not yet." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the struggle in her eyes. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders slumping as if a heavy weight had been lifted. "All right," she said quietly. "We can try." I reached out, taking her hand in mine. "That's all I'm asking," I said softly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a small glimmer of hope. And just like that, everything changed. What happens when you've had enough of betrayal? What happens when the man who once stood silent takes control? If you thought this was over, think again. The real ending is about to unfold. But here's the twist you didn't see coming: who's really in control here? Was this all a game from the start? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was I right to take this path? Or did I make a mistake? This story is far from over, and I want to know your opinion. When I look back on everything, the lesson is clear. Honesty and communication matter more than anything else. We let silence and assumptions creep in, and it tore us apart. Trust is fragile, it's built with every conversation, every moment of shared truth. And it can be destroyed in an instant by hiding how we feel. No one is perfect, but we all deserve honesty. That's what strengthens families, friendships, and communities. It's not easy to be vulnerable, but being truthful and open with each other is how we build something lasting. And if we can do that, we're better for it.